Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Gremlins 2, The New Batch, from 1990. And this is a winner of the Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. And this winner was selected by Ryan Walterson. Gremlins 2, I guess, has the premise of being a movie that Warner Brothers decided to give Joe Dante full creative control of because they couldn't figure out how to make a Gremlins sequel. So they thought, if we let this guy do whatever he wants, he'll definitely do it. I guess they were right. Also, he had a few bombs, and Gremlins 2 was born. This is a wild movie, and you can tell a studio basically gave him a lot of creative freedom. It is wild. It pokes fun at sequels right when people were writing columns and complaining about how there are too many sequels. I'm from the future, and if you can hear me in 1990, I would like you to shut the fuck up. Are you serious? You don't know what it's like. Be quiet. You don't know. You don't know. But Joe Dante knew, and Joe Dante knew the corporate overlords that were going to take over us all, and made possibly the most capitalist, anti-capitalist movie I've ever seen that also derails everything about the previous film. Now, I know the makers of Jaws wanted to do something like this with, I think it was Jaws 3 People 0, which they didn't get to do. I've heard rumors of franchises trying to do things like this, but Joe Dante succeeded, which is amazing, making fun of at least two major business people at the time, Ted Turner and Donald Trump, as well as the World Trade Center, not the tragedy, but the actual World Trade Center, and big corporate offices and big corporate conglomerates at the time. Mostly it seems like Turner, but the other two, there are specific things they reference that you're like, you're definitely making fun of that stuff. It is Joe Dante at his most unhinged, but playfully so. If you've seen the famous Key and Peele Gremlins 2 sketch, I think it gets the vibe of this movie so well because it feels like a lot of people just throwing things at the wall, but they're all sticking. I think it is very known that Joe Dante is a friend and a devotee and very influenced by Chuck Jones. Chuck Jones actually came out of retirement to do have Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck in the intro and outro, but it's sort of like Chuck Jones in that he has a theory behind what he's doing. Like, I've read his, like, he has a whole certain rules for Coyote and Roadrunner. Like, he's a very structured kind of guy, but when you watch his stuff, it's sort of, Coyote and Roadrunner definitely feels that way, but you watch his other stuff, it sometimes with the Bugs Bunny stuff, you kind of forget there is a structure, and you realize the structure is just a reason for him to do wacky gags, and none of it is a real structure. In a sense, it's like an anti-structure, because it's like, the structure is, I do whatever the fuck I want. How about that? And you're like, oh, damn it, but it works so well. How'd you do that? And that's sort of like what Dante does to an extreme degree. I'd say this is a mix. If you look at his later works, it'd be a mix between Looney Tunes Back in Action and Small Soldiers, but if those people also, listen to punk rock more. So Gremlins 2, The New Batch, Billy and Kate from the original, Phoebe Cates and Sat Galligan, have moved to New York City out of their small town. He's working in this big corporate office who's going to tear down Chinatown and gentrify it, basically, and make it into this amazing town center. A lot of the things that I was like, wow, that's even more true now. That's depressing. But yes, they're going to destroy Chinatown and make it into this very gentrified area. And Mr. Wing from the original is the main holdout, and they're trying to get him to change his mind, but then he dies. And because he dies, Gizmo is in his place destroyed. Gizmo is set free, and then the evil corporation Clamp Company takes Gizmo and puts him in their genetic lab, which they rent out for some reason, run by Christopher Lee and those two twins who also are in Terminator 2. And they start experimenting on him, and then Billy, who's working in the same office, figures out Gizmo is there, tries to save Gizmo, and actually has Kate. But then somebody accidentally gets Gizmo wet, and then, of course, more gremlins come out, and then they start going loose, and they're in the genetic labs, and one becomes a brainy gremlin, one becomes a vegetable gremlin, electricity gremlin, all the things that Key and Peele, or Jordan Peele, mentioned in the sketch. All these crazy different gremlins, because they're in a genetics lab, and they get into all sorts of things, TV studios, a Leonard Maltin show that didn't exist, because Leonard Maltin famously is friends with Joe Dante and hated the original, and gave it a bad review. I don't know if this is the only time in a horror movie. I'm wondering how many times in a horror movie and Leonard Maltin's fairly notable got attacked for giving it a bad review. And they get into cooking shows, they get into all sorts of various setups that are in this thing, while John Glover, who runs this company, is trying to stop them with Billy and Kate, and of course Christopher Lee and Robert Picardo, Dick Miller, and so many others. And it's just kind of an excuse for the Gremlins to get into all sorts of nonsense, all sorts of fun. One of them, the Brady Gremlin, is voiced by Tony Randall. It is a wild, wild sequel, and it's a lot of fun. So my experience with Gremlins, like, I didn't really watch it too much. The original, I forgot what I said in that. But with Gremlins 2, I was dating a girl, this is before my wife and stuff, and she lived at Sony Purchase in the dorms, and they had like a weird closed cable channel, and they would play all sorts of stuff. And for some reason, for a month, they played Gremlins 2, and I never saw the beginning and I never saw the end. I just saw all these like loose weirdness, and so for a long time, I watched it after all this. I just thought it was like a weird assemblance of scenes. I was like, this is a wild movie. You just like step in on, and like anytime I'd see it on cable, I actually this is a very good movie to just pop it on, because you're like, what craziness am I gonna find? Where am I in this? Oh, this thing. It makes no sense. It was that's kind of like the most I watched this movie, was like that 1 month I kept watching Gremlins 2, or parts of it. I don't think I really watched it, but like it was still, I watched it a lot for 20-30 minute chunks or whatever, and it was like, it's very watchable. There was a lot of talk at the time of a lot of sequels. I actually remember my mom listening to some NPR film discussion. They brought up Gremlins 2. I don't know what they said. I remember they were sick of sequels and horror sequels. There were a lot of them. I don't remember them. I mean, this was like 1990 and I was a kid, so I don't remember what they said. But I have found a few articles and stuff at the time. And it is funny, a lot of them don't seem to get as much that this was like an anti-sequel. I feel like Gremlins 2 is more made for now than it was in 1990. It's like, now this would be really cool and get all this critical acclaim. But then like critics were not super onto horror. Leonard Maltin gave it a good review though, so I don't know. I just think that's funny. He was allowed to do that. Like, every other critic wouldn't do that, but Leonard Maltin's like, I don't fucking care. I mean, he got attacked by Gremlins, in all fairness. So I think if you get attacked, you get to in the movie. I think that should be clear. But it's funny. He was like, no qualms about it. He gave it 3 stars, not 4 stars. So you know he's not totally partial. I do think a lot of what goes on in this, someone who works in more of a corporate office, like there was a part where his light turns off because he's not moving enough, and that is something that actually happens now. If you've ever been in a corporate bathroom and you're taking a dump and the lights turn off and you're suddenly taking a dump in the dark and you're like contemplating like when should I get up, and it's dark, and hoping someone just walks in and the lights turn on, which sounds like a nightmare, and it is. This gets the idea of corporate offices, how awful they are, the kind of idea of like having a million things in one of these huge buildings, which like the globe at the bottom, the World Trade Center famously had a globe at the bottom. Like what Ted Turner was doing, there's a ton of things about colorization with movies and various things Ted Turner did. What Kate's doing, that tour seems very much like the World Trade Center. I think there's a lot of Trump, 80s Trump. I mean, this refers to people who have greater context after 1990, so if I'm referring to those things, I'm talking about the context of 1990, obviously, but in case you think I'm referring to something else. This movie is very wild, and it's probably, I think Small Soldiers and Back in Action does that as well, but I think New Batch does it better. I think this is Joe Dante at his most Joe Dante-ness. I really, really like this movie, and I think it is I would agree with people who put it up there with the first one, because it is doing this sort of anti-thing, but it's having a lot of fun being Gremlins too. So much so that like, even if maybe it isn't the first one, like when Phoebe Cates tries to do a Lincoln's birthday thing to reference her Santa Claus bit, that didn't work, but it's like such a weird moment. I don't know. There's certain times I'm like, some of the, not everything works, but it's like it has such ingenuity and like belief in its anti-ness that I'm like, I want you to work, Gremlins 2. I want this to work out. Like it's just like, it wins you over in such a way. I don't know. I love this era of Dante. I'm a big I haven't reviewed Matinee, but I should. I used to love that movie as a kid. But it really does feel like somebody who loves animation, loves movies, loves filmmaking, but also wants to skewer them, make fun of them, and knows how corrupt the whole thing is. It is amazing in those ways. I think a lot of people talk about John Glover, who I've always heard is an experience as an actor, a really interesting person to work with. But also, like, he apparently, like, what was on the page and what John Glover did was different, is he takes it as, like, optimistic and wide-eyed. And, like, a lot of CEOs are kind of like that. Like, they swoop you into their, like, kind of presence and all this stuff. And John Glover played that perfectly. It's interesting because he could have played an 80s villain, like, typical, and he played it more in his own way, and that's sort of like what makes it sort of interesting, where you're like, this is an evil corporation, but you sort of want to follow this guy, but he's also evil. Like, I think John Glover is kind of like one of the best performances in this, because he got like what he needs to do. Everyone else is like, Christopher Lee is very good as Christopher Lee, as being like kind of the Christopher Lee type. Zach Galligan, Phoebe, I love Phoebe Cates, she's gorgeous, but she's also a great actress. In this, they are very good at everyone's sort of Dick Miller, like doing their kind of normal kind of shtick things, but John Glover is sort of like looking at this and like doing a lot more with it, which I actually think is really cool. Everything with this film feels like it's turned up to 11, but it feels like it's turned up to 11 to make fun of all this stuff. Like, what is more corporate than a sequel, especially at the time? It felt like, how could you get your auteur voice through a sequel? And even though I would argue that Wrath of Khan did that, I would argue that Stallone was doing that with the Rocky films, I would argue that was happening a lot. But I think that's not something critics in the film community were going to talk about as much. But I think like stuff like you see like The Last Jedi later, I don't think would happen without a movie like this, that's like, let's criticize what happened before and put it into a new context and reevaluate what we did before. I think my favorite Gremlin, maybe Electricity Gremlin. I like Smart Gremlin. My one disagreement on how people classify the Gremlins, I don't think he's a googly eye Gremlin. I think he's a doofus Gremlin. Like, he's not wearing googly eye. Like, googly eyes is like when it comes out when they describe him in the Key and Peele sketch, because this movie is so off the wall, even though I'd seen it, I'm like, oh, I probably missed a Gremlin because I saw it in so many different weird ways. There's probably an extra Gremlin in there I missed, which is not an insane thing to think if you haven't seen this movie in a while. Someone's like, if they haven't seen this in a while, you could pitch a Gremlin and they'd be like, I mean, that there's a good chance that's in there. I don't know. And like, I think it's a doofus Gremlin. That's my own personal opinion. The Hulk Hogan thing is amazing. Like, having the theater. I wish I'd seen this in a theater. I bet that's a lot of fun. That like, when I was watching it this time, I was like, I need to watch this in a theater. That sounds like a lot of fun. And then Hulk Hogan makes them stop. At the height of Hulk Hogan-ness, like, that is really cool. That is also like something Lord Miller would do now, and they get The Rock to do it or something. Like, that is great. That is so good. Hulk Hogan's best film role of all time. You don't even break the fourth wall. We're like outside on the street or something. This is a fun movie. This is a really fun. It feels more like an 80s movie. I was always surprised when I was like, 1990. Is everything that I'm looking up wrong about that? But it isn't. It is 1990. It is probably one of the better sequels of the 90s. And I would put it up there as one of the better sequels of all time, and one of the sequels that did the most interesting with their creative control, because it is a big corporate sequel, but it's making fun of corporations, but also like thought of like what would be the most fun with Gremlins, put them in a huge office building with different things on each floor. Like, that's a genius concept, you know. I think that's like that's a genius concept for just a horror movie. I'm surprised more like Jason didn't do that or something. Like, you're stuck in a huge office building. There's still a ton of them, trust me. Although, to be honest, they don't have interesting stuff on each floor. I think that is a movie thing most of the time. It's like, and another office, and another office, and another office. Oh, they rented out a doctor's office. It's not this fun, to be honest. I like the world that this movie lives in, but most of those offices, and even Ted Turner's and Trump's and the World Trade Center, were just a bunch of offices, to be honest. Like, most of it, they did have like, an art gallery on the 89th floor and like a restaurant and all these things. But like, it wasn't as cool as Gremlins 2. But I think this is a film that definitely satirizes what corporations were going to become, what corporate life was going to become. It satirizes in a way that has a very mean-spiritedness, but I think one that is entirely justified, specifically with like ripping off ideas, trying to make the most possible amount of money, thinking you're being more efficient with like the fire alarm that breaks down the history of fire is like one of those things that, like, when I was researching that, they brought it up and I went to that scene. I was like, that is like such a post like Apple type of thing. Like, oh, would you like to know the history of fire while you're burning alive and stuff? A lot of these do feel like something that would happen now, like a fancy new elevator. They'd probably have something like you can connect to your phone or something, but there's a lot of this stuff in here is stuff that happens now. It's not stuff that's happening then, so it sort of feels almost like as relevant as it ever was, which is funny to say all these years later, 33 years later, that this film is still entirely relevant. And I think it shows like Dante was working at this great level. I think the first one works in a very classical sense. I think this one works in a more modern sense. And, you know, as I'm talking about how this is anti this and it's recontextualizing this and he's having fun, he's doing these Chuck Jones things. I think what Joe Dante is a smart guy. I think we often talk about how silly he is, how wacky he is, how crazy he is, all his film references. But if you look at, and I keep hearing people say it's like more about the story and stuff. I don't think that this has this strong story, and like, I don't think that's like what's going on here. I think it's like the idea of the first Gremlins is this very classically told, written kind of like horror Christmas movie that is wacky and crazy and stuff, but it's like, it feels like in a small town, it feels classic Hollywood. And Gremlins 2 is like, well, let's take on the late 80s basically, even though this is 1990, but it's like, let's take on this time period with the Gremlins. And that is a different concept. It is a wholly different movie. And I think oftentimes when you have all these sequels like, you know, the Lethal Weapons and Back to the Future and stuff like that, and you had all this going on at the time, the best of those work as different films. You know, you don't really actually want to see the same thing again. And this is not at all the same movie. In fact, it's very much has an attitude about not being the same movie. And I think that's what keeps it refreshing and fun and what keeps you engaged in it. Or it kept me engaged in it a lot. If this was just like, oh, it's the town again, like that movie sounds horrible. But them doing everything and having the fun they are, even without like the political and capitalist satire in this, still really works. And I think Dante knew, like, I can't just like rip down the man and stuff like that. You know, this feels even more biting, but also than something like Small Soldiers was, but also more wide ranging than anything he was doing. But it feels like very pointed at a major corporation that was giving him the artistic control that he was basically using and getting paid for to make, you know, product for their own thing, while kind of like biting the hand that feeds him. Makes for a really, really interesting watch. And I think something like I might end up rewatching this a little more than Gremlins, because it's such a fun anti piece of cinema. It's sort of like delicious to think about all these crazy gremlins included, while, you know, he's making fun of the colorization of movies. He's making fun of like all these corporations owning everything and what they can do with it, thinking they're doing good, and making you think like, who are the real bad guys? Is it the Gremlins or is it the corporations? In the end, I guess the Gremlins are the bad guys, but it does make you think, what the fuck are they even doing in that building? And is it worth it? And weren't they the ones that started this whole mess in the first place? So if you've seen Gremlins 2, the new batch, and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.